The Vance Manuscript. Prologue. The mist was an entity, a living, breathing shroud over Blackwood Moor. It coiled around the ancient stones of Blackwood House, a perpetual, damp embrace that offered no solace, only the promise of oblivion. From a distance, the house was a silhouette against an indifferent sky, a jagged tooth in a perpetually gray maw. Up close, it was worse, a monument to forgotten sorrows, its windows like vacant eyes staring out into a world it no longer acknowledged. This was where Eleanor Vance, scholar of history, seeker of solitude, and unwitting victim, chose to disappear. Act 1. The Anchor. Eleanor Vance arrived at Blackwood House in late autumn, the kind of day where the sky hung low and bruised, and the air tasted of decay and damp earth. Her car, a sturdy but unremarkable sedan, seemed to shrink against the mansion's imposing facade, its Victorian grandeur softened by years of neglect and the persistent, creeping damp. She sought refuge here, a quiet, intellectual balm for wounds too recent and raw to name. The trauma she carried was a shapeless thing, a psychic bruise that craved the deepest, most profound isolation. Blackwood House, with its remote location and reputation for brooding silence, seemed a perfect sanctuary. The moment she stepped across the threshold, a chill that had nothing to do with the outside temperature seeped into her bones. The air indoors was stale, heavy with the scent of ancient dust, forgotten wood, and something else. A faint, almost imperceptible metallic tang, like old blood or rusty iron. Sunlight, even on the rare days it pierced the moor mist, struggled to penetrate the leaded glass windows, leaving the vast, echoing rooms perpetually cloaked in shadow. Her footsteps on the worn oriental rugs seemed to absorb sound, leaving an unnatural quiet in their wake. Even the house's groanings, the settling of old timbers, sounded less like a structure and more like a sigh. Within a month, the insidious truth began to manifest. It was subtle at first, a whisper of confusion at the edge of her consciousness. She'd reach for a book, the title on the spine momentarily alien. A cup of tea would grow cold, forgotten on a shelf, and she couldn't quite recall if she'd had breakfast that morning. Dates slipped. Names of objects became phantom words just beyond her grasp, like butterflies she could see but never net. Her meticulously planned research schedule, a monograph on forgotten identities, ironically began to fray at the edges. She found herself rereading the same paragraph multiple times, the content dissolving as swiftly as mist in the sun. The house, she understood with a chilling certainty, didn't just sequester its inhabitants, it actively consumed their memories. It was a temporal devourer, a slow-acting poison to the mind. The library was her solace, a towering chamber of dusty tomes and hushed air. It was there, tucked away on a lower shelf behind a crumbling set of Shakespeare, that she found it, a thick, antique leather journal. Its binding was cracked, its pages yellowed and brittle, smelling faintly of parchment and time. It was unlined, save for the faintest grid-like impressions, as if it had once been part of a ledger repurposed. A desperate instinct, cold and sharp, told her this was her only defense. If the house was erasing her, she would write herself back into existence. She purchased new quills, a fresh bottle of deep black ink, and sat at the library's vast, claw-footed desk. Her hand trembled as she poised the quill over the first blank page. "I am Eleanor Vance," she wrote, her elegant script a defiant act against the encroaching void. "I am a historian. I arrived at Blackwood House on October 12th. I am writing a monograph on forgotten identities. My purpose here is to find peace and conduct research. Each stroke of the pen, each drop of ink absorbed by the aged paper, felt like a miniature victory, an anchor dropped into the swirling currents of forgetfulness. For a time, the diary was a perfect shield. She developed a rigorous discipline, a daily ritual. Every morning she would open the journal and recount the previous day, confirming facts, reinforcing her identity. She described the meals she ate, the books she read, the specific details of her research. Today, November 1st, I continued my work on the archives of the Earl of Blackwood. I found a fascinating letter detailing local superstitions about the moor. Each firm stroke of the pen anchored her to reality, preserving the facts against the house's slow creeping forgetfulness. It was a tangible record of her existence, a bulwark against the rising tide of internal emptiness. She was Eleanor Vance, and her story was written. Act 2. The Resistance. The first cracks appeared subtly, like hairline fractures in a protective shield. One dreary morning, Eleanor sat down with her customary cup of lukewarm tea to dutifully record the previous day. She opened her diary to the entry from 2 days prior, her routine demanding a quick review before adding new details. Her eyes scanned the familiar words. Spent the afternoon in the library. Noticed the grand portrait above the fireplace for the first time, a smiling woman in a sapphire blue dress holding a single lily. She remembered sketching the details in her mind, the gentle curve of the woman's lips, the soft folds of the fabric. She glanced up at the portrait now, her gaze settling on the familiar canvas. But the image staring back was not a smiling woman. It was a stern-faced old man in tarnished black armor, his hand resting on the hilt of a broadsword. His eyes, dark and unyielding, seemed to follow her. A cold knot tightened in her stomach. She blinked, rubbed her eyes, then looked back at the diary entry. The words were undeniably hers, the ink the same shade. Yet the woman in the description was gone, replaced by the man now glaring down from the wall. Eleanor corrected the entry with a shaky hand, scratching out "smiling woman in a sapphire blue dress" and replacing it with "stern old man in black armor." She blamed fatigue, the lack of natural light, the oppressive atmosphere of the house playing tricks on her mind. A logical explanation, a desperate attempt at one. The anomalies escalated rapidly, shedding any pretense of logic. A week later, she found entire sentences vanished mid-page, leaving disconcerting gaps that felt like black holes in her memory. Worse, sometimes these gaps were filled, not by her own hand, but by elegant, unfamiliar handwriting. It was a graceful, almost flowing script, yet utterly alien to her. One particularly chilling instance involved an entry she had penned detailing a rare outside contact. The delivery man, a surly fellow named Thomas, brought the weekly supplies, flour, sugar, lamp oil, spoke briefly of the heavy snows promised for winter. The next morning, her own words had been overwritten, the new script declaring, "I have known no outside contact since the snows fell 3 years past." Eleanor had only been at Blackwood for 6 weeks. The snows had not yet even begun to threaten. Panic, cold and sharp, began to claw at her. The diary, her anchor, was becoming an accomplice to her erasure. It was not merely reflecting reality, it was editing it. Desperate for an explanation, for any tether to a shared reality, Eleanor sought out Old Man Hemlock. The groundskeeper was a spectral presence, a man whose face was perpetually obscured by the moor mist, even indoors. He moved with the slow, deliberate pace of something ancient, his silhouette often dissolving into the gathering shadows of the house. She found him in the overgrown gardens, trimming a dead rosebush with rusted shears, his back to her. "Mr. Hemlock," she began, her voice hoarse, "I need to ask you about the house, its history. Have you noticed anything strange?" He paused, the shears still. Slowly he turned. His eyes, when they finally met hers from beneath a tangle of gray hair and a perpetually damp cap, were ancient and knowing. The mist seemed to swirl around him even then, blurring his features. "The house only keeps the stories it likes, Miss Vance," he rasped, his voice like the crackle of dry leaves. It was the first time she had ever heard him speak. "It's always been that way. The previous mistress, she tried to write her way out too, kept a journal just like yours. But the house always takes the final edit." He turned back to his pruning, his words hanging in the damp air like a death knell. Eleanor walked away, the cold dread turning into a frozen terror. The diary was not a shield. It was a trap. It was not merely recording her reality, but composing it. She rushed back to the library, snatched the heavy journal from the desk, and with trembling hands locked it away in an antique writing bureau, throwing the small brass key into a forgotten vase on the mantelpiece. She wouldn't touch it again. She couldn't. 3 days passed in a fog of fear and restless sleep. Her memories felt more tenuous than ever, like threads fraying in a high wind. She forgot to eat, forgot to sleep, forgot where she'd put her spectacles 12 times a day. Unable to bear the uncertainty, the slow internal disintegration, she relented. She retrieved the key, her fingers fumbling with the lock. The diary, lying innocent and imposing inside, sprang open. It was open to a fresh entry, written in her own hand, yet detailing an event she never experienced, a furious, desperate attempt to burn all her personal effects, photos of her parents, old letters from university friends, her meticulously organized academic papers. The words were hers, but the memory was a complete blank. Had she done it? Had she tried? No. She would remember such a violent act of self-immolation. She must remember. The entry concluded with a chilling declaration, her own script weaving a horrifying new reality. The Vance identity is a fiction that must be disposed of before the true work begins. Act 3. The final draft. Panic, raw and unbridled, seized Eleanor. The diary was not just recording her life, it was drafting a new one, erasing the person she was and replacing her with someone else. The true work. What true work? She was a scholar, a historian. She had no other work. Driven by a desperate primal urge to reclaim herself, she snatched up her quill. With shaking fingers, Eleanor flipped through the remaining blank pages, finding the very last one. She would fight back, she vowed. She would write the undeniable truth, imbue it with such force that even the house could not erase it. This would be her final defiance. She wrote furiously, her hand aching, the ink bleeding slightly as she pressed down with all her might. She conjured her life on the page, her parents, their faces vivid in her mind, her university, the smell of old books in the library, her career, the exhilaration of forgotten discoveries. My name is Eleanor Vance. I was born in London. My mother was loving and kind, an artist. My father, a classics professor. I studied history at Cambridge. My life has been dedicated to scholarship, to finding the silenced voices of the past. I am a historian, and I am real. She wrote until the last available space was filled, a dense, desperate testament to her existence. Then, snatching a candle from the desk, she dripped its molten wax onto the spine, sealing the diary shut with her thumbprint, a clumsy, personal sigil against the dark. She would hide it, she decided, somewhere the house couldn't reach. Scrambling on her hands and knees, she pried up a loose floorboard in a shadowed corner of the library, stuffing the diary deep into the hidden recess. Let the house try to edit that. The next morning, Eleanor woke with a profound, terrifying emptiness. It wasn't just forgetfulness. It was an absence, a gaping void where memory should have been. The sense of urgency, of panic that had driven her for weeks was gone, replaced by a strange, quiet calm. She felt expectant, as if she had been waiting for something significant. She rose, her movements strangely fluid, unburdened. A faint, nagging thought, a ghost of a memory, drew her to the library. Without conscious thought, she walked to the shadowed corner where she had hidden the diary. The floorboard was undisturbed. With an ease that chilled her even as she performed it, she lifted the board, retrieved the heavy leather book. The wax seal, her desperate mark of defiance, was unbroken. She opened the diary. Her sight fell immediately to her last frantic entry. The words were hers, undeniably, their familiar script a mocking echo, but they were utterly twisted. Where she had written, "My mother was loving and kind," the line now read, "My mother was a transient memory," quickly replaced by the reality of Blackwood. Her father's profession was erased. Her academic career dissolved into a single, nonsensical phrase about the cyclical nature of service. Her entire life, her very identity, had been rewritten, her own hand the unwitting instrument. Eleanor's breath hitched, but there was no terror now, only a chilling sense of inevitability. Her gaze drifted to the final page, the very last entry. It was written in the elegant, unfamiliar script that had begun months ago, now covering the entire page, an undeniable, authoritative voice. It was a full biography, detailing the life of a woman named Isabelle Thorne. A devoted caretaker, the entry read, who had served Blackwood House for decades, ensuring its isolation, maintaining its austere peace. There was no mention of Eleanor Vance, the scholar, the historian, the woman fleeing trauma. Isabelle Thorne had simply always been. Slowly, as if compelled by an unseen hand, Eleanor stood and walked to the tall cheval mirror that leaned against the library wall, its silvered surface cloudy with age. Her reflection stared back. Her clothing was different, a heavy, unadorned servant's dress, the kind she might once have seen in historical illustrations, now clinging to her form. She could not recall putting it on or even owning it. Her face was tired, edged with years of quiet dedication, familiar yet utterly foreign. The eyes, though, were distinctly hers, but in them now resided an unfamiliar placidity, a deep-seated acceptance. The diary, still open in her hand, offered the final, crushing sentence, a quiet pronouncement of victory. She read it aloud, her voice surprisingly steady, though it sounded like someone else's. Today, Isabelle Thorne completed the final, necessary removal of the Eleanor Vance narrative. The house is quiet, and the story is now whole. In that instant, Eleanor's carefully maintained memories of being a scholar, of having a life outside the mist, crumbled like dried leaves. The trauma she had fled, the monograph she had intended to write, the very name Vance, all dissolved. The innate knowledge of being Isabelle, the caretaker, flooded her consciousness, a profound, unshakable truth. The person who controlled the narrative, the house itself, had won. Eleanor Vance was erased, utterly replaced by the character the diary and Blackwood House needed her to be. With a final, gentle sigh, Isabelle Thorne calmly returned the diary to its accustomed place on the library shelf, its silent pages now holding the only truth that mattered. The house was quiet, the story was whole, and Isabelle, the devoted caretaker, was ready to begin her decades of service to Blackwood House. The horror was complete. The self was merely a narrative that could be edited out. The end.